Hello and good morning or afternoon, seniors, whenever you may be watching this video here. I hope you're doing well. Obviously, there's going to be some big changes as to how class works since we can't all be in the same room and having discussions like we normally would. But my hope is to get that sorted out as soon as possible. For the first couple days, it's probably going to be a lot of me talking in these videos, but I want to move towards either a Google Hangout situation or a discussion board, something where you can be as big a part of the class as you've been in the past and get to kind of talk to each other and talk to me about the reading rather than just have this kind of be a one-way conversation. So I'm asking you to do a couple things over today and tomorrow, and we'll talk about the first kind of bundle of things for today, which is going to be reading the part of this article that's over here on the left side of my screen. I'm going to post this to Google Classroom. It's a book that we're going to come back to a few times. That's just, critical theory about Ralph Ellison, An Invisible Man, different scholars writing about different aspects of the book. There's an incredibly informative chapter about True Blood in this book. I'm not going to touch it for obvious reasons, but it probably lays out the best argument for why he as a character exists in Ellison's book at all, which I'm sure some of you were wondering when we read chapter 2. Anyways, the part I would like you to read um, either today or tomorrow that I'll just be talking about briefly in this video is Kitchen Mary Rambo's Blues Kitchen. It comes from a larger article um, by Valerie Sweeney Prince. Keep on Moving, Don't Stop, Invisible Man, where she talks about the form of the blues and different ideas there. Yeah, if you have an abundance of time, which you very well may, you can read the introduction to the article and get a better sense of what she's talking about here, but I don't think it's necessary for our purposes. So I asked you just to read right from this Kitchen, Mary Rambo's Blues Kitchen. It's just a few pages here. It goes down, I think it's, 5 pages in total, right down to city dispossession. And just kind of consider the argument that the scholar's making, because Prince says a couple things. I think the most important things that she says here that are relevant to us is that Mary Rambo, and specifically Mary Rambo's home, um, feel familiar to the narrator, not necessarily um, because he has a relationship with Mary that's meaningful. He specifically says they're not friends, but she represents home to him, not just the South, not just blackness, but home in a larger sense. And I would agree with Prince in that regard, that what Mary gives him is a sense of belonging that he's really never felt at any point. And of course, sadly, by the end of chapter 14, he's all too eager to cut ties with. I do think Prince walks a little too fine a line, in my opinion, when she writes that um, what she demands in return appears as a benign pressure to perform some act of leadership, some noteworthy achievement. We talked a bit in class how the narrator feels a tremendous amount of responsibility to Mary, and responsibility he doesn't feel he consented to bearing. And so this idea that Mary's just kind of joking around when she puts the weight of the world on the narrator's shoulders, I would probably disagree with, but maybe you'll read it differently, and that's totally up to you if you want to take it that way. But I just thought I would kind of summarize what I saw it as the idea that the scholar is making is that Mary's house is this kind of completely familiar place for the narrator in the largest sense of his identity, not just that Mary's black, not just that Mary has these kind of, vestiges of Southern culture, but that Mary is something that's familiar to him on the kind of deepest human level possible. This scholar talks about Mary as being a mother, literally her home being a womb that the narrator, well, I guess the womb is the underground, but this kind of being a mothering situation the narrator is birthed into when he leaves the subway. Probably sounds pretty weird, but that's academia for you. Anyways, I want to get into talking about a few of the quotes that we would otherwise discuss as a class from chapter 14. Chapter 14, like every chapter I read in this book, is longer than I remember it being. So I'm going to get through maybe 10 or 12 slides today, and then give you a break, let you kind of digest it, and then tomorrow finish up probably from the party at the Chthonian, the hotel where Jack takes the narrator, and then also have you read a short story of Ellison's that I'll talk more about tomorrow. Anyways, um, we start off, and I think the notable thing to bring up here is that food is yet again a giant kind of motif for Ellison. We've had food, the chitterlings that are making Bledsoe ashamed of himself, the debate over whether the narrator should order the kind of Southern blue plate special at the diner or the New Yorkers, orange juice, coffee, and toast, the idea of the yam making him kind of comfortable with his Southern identity for the first time. Food is constantly occurring in this book in a way that's far deeper than just something that the narrator eats. And so Mary cooking cabbage comes up in the Prince article, and she has an interesting opinion about it. But um, I think something notable is that the narrator describes it in that third sentence is cabbage was always a depressing reminder of the leaner years of my childhood, and I suffered silently whenever she served it, but this was the third time within the week, and it dawned on me that Mary must be short of money. So it's clearly not a positive image. I think there are moments when the narrator looks at his past in a bit of a bittersweet way. To me, this reads as completely kind of negative and upsetting. And so I think the narrator realizes he and the choices or the events or the fates that have brought him to Mary's door have made him a burden on Mary. And if he doesn't want to be responsible for the fate of the Black race as a whole, like Mary wants him to, he also doesn't want to be responsible for Mary either rising or falling. And the narrator again has this pressure of, you need to be independent. You need to be outstanding on your own. You can't be relying on Mary, this woman who's helping many people, um, to kind of make your existence possible. And I think in some ways that is Ellison's answer for why the narrator accepts this clearly shady deal that Jack offers him to be in the Brotherhood by the end of the chapter. But again, I think it's interesting that in this book, food plays such an important role for Ellison and the narrator, and develops that character in really deep ways that I'm certain the first time I read it went over my head. I just thought, well, yeah, the narrator's a person. He's got to eat once in a while. But I think Ellison does an amazing job of making every piece of food that appears in this book symbolic. Um, so the narrator moves on and he's thinking about Mary, and he moves into discussing Mary's problems. And probably a big part of the narrator coming to consider this is the fact that Jack was so dismissive of Mary. And not just Mary, but everyone like Mary, somebody older, somebody comfortable with the system in place. In his meeting with the narrator at the end of, gosh, maybe it was 13, where the narrator is giving the speech and then runs away, and Jack follows him into the cafe and they talk. The narrator's still turning that around in his head, and I think he's still coming to grips with the idea of leaving people behind, and especially leaving somebody like Mary behind, who is the only person so far in this book who has refused to leave the narrator behind. And so we see the narrator grappling with morality in the relationships that he has. She kept me going for months, yet I had no idea what kind of man was I becoming. I had taken her so much for granted that I hadn't even thought of my debt when I refused the job, nor had I considered the embarrassment I might have caused her should the police come to her home to arrest me for making that wild speech. So, again, somebody torn in two directions. On the one hand, he's grateful for Mary, that she's taking care of him. On the other hand, the other side of that bargain is that Mary's bearing costs, and it's not just monetary costs, it's costs of social status, it's perhaps legal costs if she's seen as harboring this man who just incited a riot at the eviction a chapter ago. So I think the narrator is still in that place of um, really being uncomfortable when he is comfortable, feeling like he's putting somebody out anytime he allows himself to be happy. And whether or not he ever allows himself to be happy or becomes independent, I guess that's a question that is in place until the very last word of the book. But the narrator at this point very clearly feels like somebody helping him is not just out of the goodness of their heart, that there's a deal, whether they realize it or not, that they're a part of and that he's paying into. And for the narrator, that seems like a pretty uncomfortable place to be in every sense that he's gone through the book, feeling like he owes Bledsoe something, Norton something, um, Mr. Emerson, Kimbrough, Brockway. I think everybody to a large degree the narrator has come into conflict with was because he felt like there was a deal in place that he was paying more into than he got out of. So I'm just going to skip over this one because I think it's a good quote, of course, but I think it just kind of brings up the same ideas as the last quote, the narrator feeling like he owes Mary something. I think the difference here is maybe that last sentence, and she might receive some satisfaction that her prediction had proved correct. But the narrator, at the same time of despising Mary for wanting him to do well and putting that pressure on him, having that expectation that he makes something of himself, that he saves the race, that he is successful. He also, when he feels like that's coming his way, um, flips it and says, well, now it's good for me and her. Now she's going to be happy. So I think we see him being kind of opportunistic with his own morality, that when things aren't going his way, it's because people have set up the deck to be unfair. But when things are going his way, it's because he wants to share the wealth. And I think, again, that's a sign of the narrator's immaturity at this point, his unwillingness to accept failure and his eagerness to accept success. We have the strange, and I say the word strange literally in that first sentence, setting of the Chthonian here, which is this building, this hotel, this apartment, whatever it is, this giant building that the narrator is going to spend the rest of the chapter getting to know the Brotherhood in. And one thing that Ellison keeps kind of moving towards in this chapter, and we'll see it with some quotes coming up, is that we know that the Brotherhood is supposed to be the Communist Party, and we know that the Communist Party is supposed to be something for the workers, that the idea of people having a disproportionate amount of wealth is wrong. At the same time, the Brotherhood is characterized as um, being two-faced in that regard. They'll talk about the need to help the worker. They'll talk about the need to raise everybody up, but they're in this incredibly expensive building with incredibly expensive decorations and people wearing expensive clothing and drinking expensive liquor. So I think Ellison is showing the kind of ideological bankruptcy at work, that everything that Jack says about wanting to help the working class and the working man get their fair shake is hard to stomach because Jack's wearing an expensive suit and because Jack is renting apartments in the most expensive part of town and because Jack throws the narrator $300 like it's nothing. So Ellison in his personal life was disenchanted with the communists, and I think we see that coming through here, the idea that communism is a lot of lip service and not much change, that, the idea of there being a moneyed elite is in place no matter what the kind of rhetoric is about the changes that the new government will have in place. We also bring up Emma here, who's maybe Brother Jack's girlfriend, maybe not. It's hard to tell. But we see in that first sentence that she has a clip of blazing diamonds. Obviously, that's, again, a sign of wealth. We also have the narrator realizing that things are different in the Brotherhood. And so his interactions with women, and particularly white women, up to this point have been intense, to say the least. The first one is the woman who is dancing naked in the boxing ring back in chapter one with the battle royal. We have a few other women here and there. The woman who's eating the red apple when the narrator is leaving the factory hospital and actually walking straight up to where he's going to meet Mary. And then we also have the woman on the um, subway that he's standing near the first time he's riding the subway, and he's terrified because his hands are down at his sides, and he thinks that the woman's going to claim that he touched her. He doesn't realize that everybody's just trying to get from point A to point B in New York, and so he's kind of mapping on this anxiety that he would have had in the South into this northern area and not really realize that he's probably the only one having that. But Emma represents something different, and Emma represents a sexuality and a sensuality he actually can come in contact with. Disturbed not so much by the close contact as by the sense that I'd somehow been through it all before. I couldn't decide if it were from watching some similar scene in the movies from books I'd read or from some recurrent but deeply buried dream. He's starting to take on these roles that are coming from other places. And he and the narrator, sorry, the notification threw me off. He and the reader don't necessarily know where this is from and maybe never do, but we realize the game has changed, that Emma's clearly flirting with him, seeing her smile as though there were only she and I. And he's allowed to at least appreciate that in a way he was never allowed to before. I think that's part of what makes this so unsettling for the narrator is that he's not just allowed to be around the people, but allowed to be around these women and allowed to flirt and allowed to look at them in the eye. And of course, for him, this is probably another giant first that not only has race, but also sexuality mapped onto it and is kind of throwing him off in terms of how he's supposed to act and what's safe to do and what's unsafe to do. This I'll just skip over real quickly, but this is bringing up the ornate and expensive decorations in the Chthonian. I think the most important part there, where Ellison's kind of beating us over the head, is I was struck by the contrast between the richness of the room and their rather poor clothing. So these men who dress as though they're kind of average people spend their nights, smoking expensive cigars and drinking expensive bourbon in probably one of the most expensive buildings in New York. It's hard to take them seriously that their efforts to improve life for the dispossessed are sincere and not just either some form of self-delusion or some larger plan that doesn't have anything to do with making everybody that wealthy. This is another one, just quickly, where the narrator is bringing up that he gets to see these several attractive young women, and I think the narrator is again realizing that difference between Southern racism and Northern racism that Ellison's been bringing up for a few chapters now. He gets to look at them, but in some ways that almost seems more dehumanizing than what happened with the woman in the boxing ring back in chapter one, because he says, quote, "It was as though they hadn't seen me, as though I were here and yet not here, as though he were ... invisible." So the idea that he's not a threat, and not only not a threat, but not noticeable, not present, seems to rattle him as much as the men from his town who are yelling those horrible things about looking and not looking at him. The idea of, again, I think being present with a negative image is constantly being contrasted with being invisible or being non-existent. And I think for the narrator, one's never necessarily better than the other. He feels pretty out of place no matter which one is kind of being forced upon him. We see Brother Jack in this chapter taking the reins of the Brotherhood and therefore the Communist Party, and he throws out these little kind of aphorisms, these little sayings that would seem very familiar to a communist or the Brotherhood at this time. But the biggest thing that happens here is he asks Emma for a drink, and Emma responds, quote, "Well, now I'll have to think about it." And she's flirting, probably with the narrator here. But Brother Jack responds, "Don't think, act. We're very thirsty men. This young man has pushed history ahead 20 years today." That "don't think, act" line is going to come up a lot. There's a chain of command that everyone, Emma, the narrator, even the other white brothers, are going to be expected to follow, and that coming up with your own ideas in the Brotherhood is not desirable. You let somebody like Jack tell you what to do, because he's in charge. And I think one of the things that Ellison seems to be playing with is kind of like his scene with the Union back at the chapter with Liberty Paints, that there seems to always be a power structure in place where one person's telling another group, "I know what's best for you, and you're going to listen to me and not question it." And, I think there's a big difference between slavery and, a labor union. But Ellison seems to be playing with that idea that this is something that's heard constantly. This is something that um, different people in different configurations, whether they're of the same race, whether they're of the same gender, whether they're of the same class, whether they're of the same political beliefs, there seems to always be the structure of one smaller group telling a larger group, "I know what's best for you, and you're going to do what I say because that's the case." So I think that "don't think, act" is going to be a huge part of Brother Jack's kind of persona going forward. And the narrator will bump into that just as he bumped into that with Bledsoe, with taking Mr. Norton on the drive, because the narrator is going to do his best and sometimes go off script if he feels like it's in the best interest of whatever is kind of the goal as he sees it. And Brother Jack, like Dr. Bledsoe, is going to say, who kind of put you in charge. You follow the program as I say, and your position is not to sit here and come up with your own ideas about what to do. So this one is pretty similar to that earlier quote about the women at the party. We see that the narrator again is understanding that the racism in the North isn't something like the N-word, isn't something like a lynching. It's this idea that you're not worthy of notice. And I think the narrator, even to some degree, picks up on that when he's walking to the different buildings to drop off his letters. And I know in class we talked about how he saw those black men with bags of money tied to them. And we talked about what that symbolized. And one of the things that came up in at least one of the classes was that the reason these black men were allowed to shuffle the money back and forth was there was no realistic expectation, A, of them doing anything more than that, but B, of them doing anything bad with that. They were basically just a delivery system. They weren't human. And so we see the narrator thinking on that as well when he says, quote, "It was not the harsh, uninterested in you as a human being stare that I'd known in the South, the kind that swept over a black man as though he were a horse or an insect. It was something more a direct, 'What type of mere man have we have here?' kind of look that seemed to go beneath my skin." He's contrasting that with the South there, but it's not necessarily something that makes him feel better, because he's going to realize he's a tool, the same way that the black men shuffling money back and forth in the bags tied to their legs on Wall Street are. The only reason the Brotherhood is talking to him at all is because they see him as furthering a purpose that they have. And he seems to pick up on that very quickly. Maybe that "what type of a mere man have we here" sounds a bit flirtatious if it's coming from Emma, but I think we see by the end of the chapter that that question is, and how can we use him to profit? And obviously, I think that harkens back to a long history of the Black experience in the United States of being looked at not as a human being, but as a way to serve a goal, and probably a goal related to money or business. So we'll move on to the next one. We see Emma here making her first faux pas. And she'll make a few more after this. But she asks, "Don't you think you should be a little blacker?" And I think that's where we and the narrator realize, again, her interest in him was not personal. It was not because she thought he was smart. It was not because she thought he was attractive. It was not because she thought he was kind. It was because apparently the Brotherhood needed someone black, and not just needed somebody black, but needed somebody blacker than the narrator for whatever was going to be going on here. And Brother Jack replies, "Shh, don't be a damn fool. We're not interested in his looks, but in his voice. And I suggest, Emma, that you make it your interest too." So Brother Jack backs up, but you'll see, and we won't probably get to it today, in the scene with the man asking the narrator to sing, Brother Jack is this kind of um, racial police, so to speak, in the chapter. He jumps in and says, "You're allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say that." Notably, the narrator will sit back and say, "Why am I not allowed to say how people address me? Why do I need Brother Jack on my behalf, kind of jumping in and having these fights for me if I don't even know they're fights worth having or if they're fights at all?" He'll ask that about the man who asks him to sing in a bit, but we see Brother Jack stepping in and kind of taking moral high ground and admonishing the people around him for making race a part of it. Of course, we as readers find that ironic because Jack was hung up on race, even though he said he wasn't, back in the cafe with the narrator. So then the narrator goes on, "So she doesn't think I'm black enough. What does she want? A black-faced comedian? Maybe she wants to see me sweat coal tar, ink, shoe polish, graphite. What was I? A man or a natural resource?" And again, we get back to that idea of the narrator being a commodity, being a machine, being something that's going to create profit, not somebody who, as an individual, is worth anything to this group. Okay, so we'll end here with this quote. I'll just give my thoughts on this and then let you take a look at that article. Again, I hope, especially if you read 14 before the break, you're maybe looking up on lit charts or Schmoop or Spark Notes, whichever your favorite, honest reading guide that you only use after doing the reading yourself is. Look back after it and get a sense of kind of what the chapter was about. But this last quote is Brother Jack talking with the other men in the Brotherhood and the narrator about the possibility of what the narrator is going to be. And we'll pick up tomorrow with Brother Jack specifically naming Booker T. Washington as who the narrator should model himself after. And that's been a presence throughout this book since the first chapter where the narrator gives the Atlanta Compromise speech. And the narrator is starting to struggle with this, but Brother Jack seems to set this up. What are we doing? What is our mission? It's simple. We are working for a better world for all people. It's that simple. Too many have been dispossessed of their heritage, and we have banded together in brotherhood so as to do something about it. What do you think of that? If you notice, Brother Jack says a lot, but doesn't really give much of an answer. And especially if we consider the fact that he's putting away, a high-priced bourbon as he's saying this, the idea that he wants a better world for all people and to give everybody their heritage back and their equality back and their brotherhood or sisterhood back, it seems like a tough sell. The narrator seems to pick up on this. Why I think it's fine, I said, trying to take in the full meaning of his words. I think it's excellent, but how? By moving them to action just as you did this morning. And again, Brother Jack comes back to this idea of action over thought. It's not that he wants to truly make the people watching that eviction conscious in the sense that they're thinking about the issues, they're thinking about Marxism, that they're thinking about capitalism. He just wants action, and preferably action without people realizing what they're doing. So that's something that the narrator and Brother Jack are going to come into conflict with on a pretty regular basis for most of the rest of the novel. That the narrator wants to understand the world, and Jack says you lost that opportunity when somebody like me also existed in this world. That I, as Brother Jack, am going to explain this to you when I see fit and tell you what to do no matter what. And the narrator's position, or Brother Jack's opinion, is to not question that, simply to do what is asked of him, no matter how self-destructive or manipulative or degrading that seems to be. So we'll stop there. Again, it's probably going to be a lot of me talking these next couple of days, but I really want to get you guys more involved here. So I will post this video. I'll post the whole book of criticism about Invisible Man as a PDF so that we can take a look at that when we want to over the next few classes, and post the response as well. Remember that we will also talk about the rest of chapter 14 tomorrow with a new video, and I'll talk about Ellison's short story that I'm going to post as well. So I hope you have a good afternoon. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, and I will hear from you soon and post a new video tomorrow.